Hello everybody, it's Friday the 18th of December and welcome to this session for the National Inset Day organised by the Greenshaw Learning Trust. It's amazing what they've done in such a short time. I'm blown away by the level of support and interest and the effort that has been made to make this come to be. So I hope you enjoy this session. I'm going to talk about 6 things that made my teaching better for me and my students. And I was thinking about teachers coming to the end of the most grueling few months of all time and looking ahead to next year and hoping things would be kind of easier, more manageable. So I was thinking of things which would make my life easier as a teacher and which I did when I was teaching, which also are better for my students. And I've made a small selection. I always think about this. In fact, I think about this more and more when I'm doing training, which is basically my job these days. I sit at the back of a lot of lessons because I go in and I observe lessons. Sometimes I'm with a middle leader or a senior leader and we're just getting a feel for what's happening in the school. And I sit at the back of the class. And more I think in this way that teachers have to do an incredible amount and it's overwhelming at times. And it's even if you have the right intentions, actually delivering a lot of your intentions is difficult because of the dynamics of the class. And even teachers who have crafted wonderful explanations, have got great resources, and are working really hard around the room to get as many students involved as possible. It's still possible for some students to find that difficult. And I think one of the main things is to adopt a mindset where kind of that's okay. That's kind of the way things are. And what you're doing is you're not sort of failing when those things occur. It's actually just how things are because it's that difficult. But what you need to be doing is just trying to make accommodation for that and try as best as you can to deal with the inherent imperfections of what is actually a very difficult thing. And with that mindset, it kind of lets you off of the sort of pressure of feeling like there's any sense of failure in not absolutely nailing every time you've taught something to every single student at the same time. So I think that's the first thing, but that isn't one of the 6. It's a kind of the mindset I think is important, that even exceptional teachers don't absolutely nail everything all the time. And if you've got routines and systems which help us to kind of deal with that more, we're more likely to. So let me get into the 6. The first one is really a kind of positive behavior management attitude. And you might do this already. And if you do, and it's natural to you, you might think, this isn't a big deal. But I'm going to say to you that for me, this was an absolute game changer, because for a good many years working in a tough comprehensive school in London, I found behavior management incredibly difficult. And I used to get incredibly wound up and negative. And I developed a kind of, I don't know, it became a problem for me with some of my classes where as soon as they walked in the door, my heart would sink and I would start thinking, oh, come on, and you haven't done this, and why hasn't that happened? And will you stop talking? And of course, that group hasn't done their homework. And they were expecting me to behave like that to them. And the whole thing was a kind of war of attrition. And I had that with a few classes. So I realized it was kind of my fault rather than theirs. And then I saw the Bill Rogers videos where he talks about positive behavior management. And one of the strategies in there is positive framing. And it's a conscious decision to change my language in lessons to focus on positive things. And this is the walkthrough that we've made, which describes this. So clearly you have to have expectations. The students are supposed to know what you're trying to achieve in your class. But the thing that I changed was, instead of always correcting students for not meeting my very high expectations, I would focus on the students who were. And that was actually a change I made. And it was better for them because people doing the right thing were getting affirmed for that. But also it meant that the students who weren't were more likely to just sort of get in with the flow. So I started saying things like, thanks guys, well done everybody, that's great. Thank you for everyone for doing this homework. Wow, look at how much lovely homework I've been given. Instead of saying, why haven't you done yours and why haven't you done yours, which is previously how I'd been doing things. And again, if you do that naturally, then that's great. But I'm going to say, if you don't do that naturally, it really, really pays off. Even when you're telling students to sort of do the right thing when they're not, like, can I have you looking this way and listening, thanks. Now, when I first started doing that, I thought I was acting out Bill Rogers. I was sort of pretending to be Bill Rogers. So it felt a bit false. But actually, it just became a thing that it worked so well. I thought, well, I'm going to carry on. And it became part of how I teach. So guys, can I have you looking and listening this way? Thanks. Thanks everyone. This table's ready. Have we got this table ready? Not quite. Thanks very much. Brilliant. Well done. And it's all this positive affirmation. And boy, guys, I just thought, why wasn't I doing this for 5, 10 years? I could have done with it. So that's the first thing. Positive framing is a technique. It's a language thing which you use to affirm the positive, get students doing the things you want and not obsessing about correcting. And it even goes out into the corridors. So you see a group of students, whatever they're doing, and if you think they shouldn't, you just say, hey guys, can I have you running isn't allowed, is kind of what you want to say. But you don't, you just say, let's have everybody walking sensibly down the corridor, thanks, well done. So it has lots of implications, this whole positive language, because you get what the behaviors that you want and you've created a kind of positive relationship building exchange. And most importantly, I just think it helps you mentally, emotionally to be in a calmer frame of mind for doing the things you need to be doing, which is kind of focusing on the teaching aspect. And the students trust you more. It just has so many positives. So that's my first one. Better for the students and definitely better for me. And it is a definite shift you need to make. It's not something which everybody finds comes naturally to them. And I certainly had to learn how to do it. The next one is a favorite behavior routine around questioning. And I say it's a behavior routine because this is something which I find some teachers kind of shy away from because of their concerns about behavior. And they worry that allowing students to do pair share kind of is a kind of loss of control, which they're not prepared to concede because, you know, it feels right to have order. I've got it and I've achieved that, which has taken some effort. And if I say, right, even your pairs discuss, I'm kind of giving it over. But I found that there are lots of situations where lessons are just quite difficult, stifling almost, if you overmanage all of the questions. And this happens with adults, where you sort of run out of road with people generating ideas, or even when you're cold calling and selecting, people don't have an answer. And you get this sort of feeling of everyone being inhibited. And that's the thing where I think when students start being inhibited, they sense that there's a sort of atmosphere of, oh my God, nobody knows. This is hard. Oh, better not say anything. And they kind of shy away. And you get this, what I call the blood out of a stone feeling. So whenever you get in that, whenever you've created inadvertently this kind of blood out of stone, frozen, inhibited feeling. It can happen, say, even with a lively class when a visitor comes in, no one wants to say anything. This is what releases it, the pair share, think, pair, share. You say, okay, you might do it on a planned basis, of course, but you can do it spontaneously. Things aren't going so well, you're not getting so many answers. Now you could decide to re-explain something, but often you think, no, I've done that well enough. It's just they need to kind of oil their thinking, get going a bit. So say, okay, in your pair, and they need to have a pair, obviously. What I want you to do is see if you can explain this to somebody else. Imagine you were explaining this to somebody else. What would you say to them? And that type of question I find is really useful because you're kind of externalizing the explanation. How would you explain this to somebody else, but not publicly in the whole class, which has been the problem. And all of a sudden, and I'd say this happens nearly every single time. You say, in your pair, I'm going to give you 3 minutes, so it's time specific. I want you to come up with an explanation for this idea as if you were explaining it to somebody, say, younger than you. Okay, off you go. And then, boom, everyone's talking. And it's amazing. You think, well, a few seconds ago, it was blood out of a stone. Now everyone's talking. And you realize, actually, it takes a bit of time for them to start thinking, well, gosh, what do I do? And what would I say? How would I explain that idea? And you realize, actually, the reason they couldn't get answers in the room is because you've asked them a good question, probably, and they really do need some time to think and to not worry about how accurate they're being straight away. So there's a kind of safety in a pair where you can just say to your friend, I haven't got a clue, have you? I haven't got a clue. And then they start sort of piecing their way through it. And actually they do have a clue. It's just they don't know where to begin. And if you're circulating, now obviously we're in COVID restricted classrooms, this has been incredibly hard, but if you can circulate, you sort of start to pick up. And I've seen some teachers do this brilliantly. They sort of just say, okay, everyone, back to me, whatever the signal for attention is. 3, 2, 1, and listening. Okay, there's a couple of people I've picked up that you're saying this word incorrectly, or the key idea is this. And remember, you're trying to explain the whole thing, not just kind of a simple thing. So they give a bit of feedback partway through the discussion, say, right, back off you go. And then the students move on. And of course, at the end, you have to sort of select the answers and cold call the pairs. So everybody knows when they do pair share that they could be asked to volunteer their answer. Therefore, they need to invest some time in it. And it's not just something they can just leave to the other children who normally give the answers after a pair discussion. It's got to feel like, no, this could be us. So we need to really do this properly. So there needs to be a kind of accountability in there. But boy, this has bailed me out so many times of kind of that lessons feeling like we've dug ourselves into a pit and we need to get out of it. Think, pair, share, everyone's talking, and then you solicit answers from the groups, and it's like, great, now we're thinking, now we're sharing ideas. It works a dream. Works a dream with adults in training, works a dream with students. Marking. Now I could go on about this at length. The key thing here is to own this. And to keep it in perspective, and never set yourself up to fail where you've made promises to people that you can't keep. And that's often what happens. You box yourself into a corner because you've set out these expectations, and the students think this piece of work they're going to do is going to be marked in some detail, and that becomes their source of validation. And if you don't do it, they feel that you've somehow let them down, or that you create a kind of negative space there. So the first thing is to make sure that when you're setting out your marking and feedback, that you're very deliberate to say, this is what I'm going to mark, and in the sense of me taking the books in and the work in to mark it myself, and this is what I'm not. And then to be quite precise about what that might be in terms of its most usefulness. So for me as a teacher, towards the end of my teaching time, mostly I was just marking tests because and they were quite broad tests, because that's when I felt I needed to get closer to understanding what the students could and couldn't do myself more, and to add it up and give them scores and so on in a quite serious and intensive way, and be much more comfortable to just look at books to see what has been done and use lesson time to do to address kind of some of the issues, rather than wading through this sort of slightly bizarre process of writing written comments in all of their books, hoping that they would read them in the lesson, understand them, act on them. And more and more I found that was kind of pointless. There are times where you do need to do a bit of marking, like someone's crafted an essay. Can they really get good feedback from a peer assessment of a whole essay? Probably not. So you have to sort of manage your workload in terms of how many essays you can actually manage to mark and therefore set in that way. So the main thing is to get it in perspective and never overdo it. Now, I've had more teachers when I was ahead in my office sort of in tears over marking pressure than probably over anything else. And normally I'd say, well, no, my answer to this is to do a total reset. And no one's going to object, and certainly I wouldn't. Just reset, like from now on, you have no marking. Like that's it. You can just decide that. I'm not marking any of the work that has been done before because it's overwhelmed me, and I'm a human being. I'm allowed to make that choice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to start from now to have a more manageable regime of feedback, which includes a manageable amount of marking that I do. And that's totally legitimate. You might want to clear it with your line manager. But I've done that many times with teachers. It's so liberating. I think, oh, thank God. There's nothing worse than retrospective marking of work that's, the water's under the bridge. If you didn't mark it at that time, it's gone. And tidying up the books to look like they were marked is really super pointless in terms of learning. And then think ahead and say, okay, I'll mark that and I'll mark that because I've got time. And the rest of the time, what do? Well, we do peer assessment, self-assessment, and lots of whole class feedback. So you might collect the books in and just scan them, look for general issues, reteach them in the lessons and give some whole class feedback. And you just create affirmation through being in the room with the students. So you've looked at their books, you tell them, I looked at your books, wow, amazing work, some really good examples. And then you give them maybe some individual praise where you think it's particularly good, but students need to learn that's kind of the deal. That's the level of affirmation I'm going to get. The teacher will notice my work because they'll have read it, but it's not through the red pen. It's through the communication and the more organic stuff. And sure, I'll get that test marked and that essay marked, and that's my deal. Make it something you can manage. So I always think it's true at a department level that you should do this as a department. Set out your marking frequency at a sustainable level and just do the thing you say you're going to do, and don't overpromise, because nobody benefits from that. Another thing I'd say, this is just an image of a planning tool that I made, where which is on my website. It's just a kind of graphic really, but like a lot of people, when I first started teaching, I would be thinking about my lesson, but very quickly I realized that this was a fruitless thing for a number of reasons. None of my lessons were according to plan, basically. And why not? Because the students respond in different ways, and often in unpredictable ways. And so you can't actually plan a lesson per se, but what you can do is plan, say, look, we need to cover a certain amount of curriculum, because that's we all understand that idea, by a certain time if we're going to finish everything. So you plan, say, I don't know, 6 lessons, 12 lessons, 6 weeks of learning, and you think we're going to cover all this material, and then each lesson is just the next stage along the way. And when you're doing that, it allows you to do all sorts of different things, like a lesson where you just do, acting on feedback and redrafting, a lesson where you just do loads of practice and much less instructional input, other lessons where you do lots of instruction, demonstration, modeling. So lessons can have a very different kind of feel to them, because you realize that that's where you need to go next on the overarching journey. And, as a science teacher, I used to sort of plan things like, the practical equipment, because someone else was involved, technicians and so on. So I needed to involve them. And what would my planning normally be? Well, towards the end of my career, I could just look at the key resources, like the scheme of work, and on the textbooks sometimes, because textbooks are good for planning, I found, and say, well, that's what I'm doing. I know what I'm doing. Here's the resources, and that's my plan. I know what I'm doing. But I'd be looking long all the time. I'm just trying to get to cover all of that. And it gives you much more time to kind of finesse things as you're going along. If you try to construct a perfect lesson, with how everything works from start to finish in 60 minutes or whatever, it just takes too much time. So see if that makes a difference to you. It made a massive difference to me, as when I realized this is what was needed. It just becomes much leaner. So your planning documents are sort of series of lessons. You might normally say, well, I'll do 2 lessons on that, 1 on that, 1 on that, and then maybe 2 or 3 lessons on that, boom, boom, boom. And you've got a sort of nice framework. You can see where you're going, and you can pace it up the pace a bit. We need to get through a little bit. And the more confident your students become, the more independent you've trained them to be, you can accelerate quite a lot later on in a course, especially something like a GCSE. You can start relying on them to study harder, and you can make that a part of the expectation. So that's another reason, when you've got long-term planning, that the pace of it can get faster and faster when you invest time early on to get students into the kind of the rhythm of how lessons typically work, and all those routines. Here's another one. I don't want to get into the whole debate about differentiation as a term, because a lot of people, for good reasons, say, we shouldn't be talking about differentiation, because to them, it means that every single student, well, certainly groups of students, have very different work constructed for them. And there is a sort of ludicrous legacy, which is, reinforced by inspections and all sorts of processes, where you would be judged negatively if in a lesson it wasn't evident that different students had different tasks for them to meet their needs. That was the kind of the idea. Now that idea is hopefully kind of on its way out, if it's not dead and buried. And people are right to challenge that idea that students have lower expectations of them. But at the same time, I have this raised with me constantly, nearly every time I meet a group of young teachers, newer teachers. This is one of the key challenges. How do you teach everybody in the room when students evidently make progress at different rates? It comes, it's a genuine challenge. It happens very quickly with a group. So differentiation doesn't mean lowering expectations, but it definitely means that you have to adjust and adapt the way you teach certain students so that they can all be consolidating things they know, they're having a high success rate, they're progressing and developing and building confidence. And it's like, any kind of metaphor you can use, like we're all aiming for the top of the mountain, but we're not, some of us might get there faster, or others might need more support to get there, but we're all going there. here I've talked about gardening, and I found this when I started thinking about this and allowing myself to think this, it just was liberating for me. I can't literally meet everybody's needs perfectly in any given moment. I just can't. But what I can do is treat you like a kind of garden of specimens, where I want the whole garden to flourish as a whole, and I want every specimen to thrive. But at any given moment, I might not be able to be paying precise attention to you because it's just not humanly possible. So what I do is I create the conditions, generally speaking, where things are thriving. So my core routines are successful. I'm involving everybody in the questioning. I'm involving everybody in the retrieval practice. My expectations are high. And then day to day, what I'm doing is I'm thinking, okay, who needs my attention at the moment more than others maybe? And it could be, you've got some students who are really flying high, are pushing ahead, and you think, okay, I need to keep them really kind of on fire here. So I'm going to give them these, I've found some harder questions, or I'm just going to allow them to sort of push on a little bit because I feel they're ready for it. And that's something I have a little word with them. I have to set up opportunities in the room for people to be doing some practice while I go and have a word with those. And that's that bit of it. Another time, I realized that, there are some students like really properly struggling, like they're finding this really hard. So I gather them together and we have a bit of a reteach, we go over some things while other people are practicing. And I notice from their books, for example, that there's 3 or 4 students that just haven't got a clue about this whole concept. Do I need to reteach it to the whole class? Well, no. So I'm going to deal with them. And I do that. And I do that sort of as and when I feel it's appropriate. Even if most of the time I'm standing at the front and teaching everybody together, I have in my head that there's some people who need me. And that's okay. That's fine. I think there are some bottom lines with that. There are some students when in terms of like access, like, if you've got a student who's visually impaired, for example, I mean, that's not like you can give them attention when you can manage it. That they have an entitlement to that day in, day out, come what may. And that's like a non-negotiable, but I think people understand that. I'm talking about the level of confidence. This image shows a planner. I made this for myself. Now, I'm not saying people should go and do this, but this was from a class that I actually taught, although I've changed the names. And I found this helped me. So this helped me. I'm not saying people should do this, but I felt if I had a sense of the students, there were 4 groups. There was the kind of the core. There were 4 students who were just like, they were kind of exceptional, to be honest. And I felt I did need to notice them a lot. Then there was a group of students who I needed to make sure definitely read the stuff and make sure they could kind of access it, but with a little bit of help. And there were also some students who just were tough. It's a very mixed ability group who found it really hard. And unless I gave them some help, which was quite tailored to them in terms of the resourcing, they would find the mainstay of the lessons hard to access. So this was my practical strategy. And I wouldn't be able to give all 4 of those groups attention every lesson. I would sometimes prioritize some over others. I think that's fine. I think that's natural. I think that's what people do. But you need to kind of give yourself permission to do it. Again, the students benefit. And I definitely think as teachers, we benefit because it allows ourselves the freedom. It's just sensible. And last of all, this is where you kind of, it benefits the students and it definitely benefits you. Occasional open response tasks. Now, why would you do this? Well, there's lots of reasons. I just think even if you're a sort of a majorly instructional teacher and that's your default mode of teaching, I have found that even if you do this, say, twice, 3 times a year, even just 1 time, you give students a genuine open choice about the way they respond to a piece of learning. It's rewarding for them, it's rewarding for you, it brings joy into the class, and why wouldn't you want that? And it teaches them, importantly, it teaches them to make some choices. And that's quite an important skill in learning. You have to make all sorts of choices in life about, say, things that you might be interested in, things to ask more questions about, books to read. So if you create a kind of choice structure within a task where you say, look, you could respond in all sorts of ways to this, and you have to make that choice, you just get surprised and delighted. And it's part of, remember, a mainstay of teacher-led learning probably, but it still has it. It's like a little nugget of gold, which has a sort of impact way beyond the time it took. And I've had just the most amazing responses. In fact, I would say nearly all of the best responses I've had from students in terms of learning have come when I've allowed them to choose what they produced. Now, that wouldn't work if you did it all the time. In fact, it worked because it was an occasional thing, not because it was absolutely routine, in my view. So I've had things like, I remember a boy I taught RE for a while. He made this unbelievable book of kind of creation myths that he had gathered from all these different faiths, which I didn't even know about. He was in year 7, and he made this exceptional book. It was like, wow, look at this thing that you've made. It was amazing. And he'd crafted it as a labor of love. I've had students make incredible websites. I'm often sharing those on my training. I remember a girl I taught for science who made this video, like a YouTuber, explaining how dogs have all basically the same species, but through selective breeding, they've taken on so many forms. And she explained it sort of in her bedroom as a kind of YouTuber video with some graphics, which she made this video on her phone. I didn't know she could talk so well about science. In lessons, she was much shyer than that. And I'd never seen her talk in such an extended way with such enthusiasm. It totally changed my view of her as a learner, because she had the opportunity to make a video, which was then celebrated. Now, if we'd made everybody make a video, it would have been a schlep, wouldn't it? Like, let's watch everybody's video. No, she was the only one that chose to make a video. So we watched it. It was brilliant. And like, she got a big round of applause from her friends at the end. They thought, wow, look at you. And so I was like, wow, it was great. Now, those sort of wow moments are special in teaching. So creating them is something you need to kind of think about. But don't do it all the time, and don't define it as your kind of teaching style. It's not. It's just a thing you craft into the curriculum here, here, and here, and it has a sort of big power. So those are my 6 things. Things which are good for you as a teacher: make teaching easier, better, emotionally more rewarding, and in terms of the learning, more enriching, hopefully, for them as well, or definitely for them. So there you go. Thanks very much for listening to this talk. I hope you found that useful. Thanks so much to Greenshield Learning Trust for inviting me to be part of this and for setting up the whole thing. Have a great Christmas, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Have the biggest rest you can possibly manage, and hope when term starts back, you'll be ready for it. So thank you so much for listening.